The paddle hissed through cave water that felt 40 degrees colder than the river, and the beam from my headlamp trembled where rock swallowed light. On a lip of limestone slick with moss and history, we dragged up a green nylon backpack bloated with silt. It looked smaller than it should have, mud-caked straps, like veins, rusted buckles, a knot on the shoulder line I'd seen once before in warmer light. When I set my hand on the wet fabric, the current kept speaking, and the cave answered back like a chest full of secrets. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and hit like and subscribe if you believe some names should never fade. I wasn't always the man hauling gear out of dark water. Back then, I was just Mike from the county office, a detective who still carried a pen behind his ear and kept a jar of peppermint candies on the edge of his desk. Cedar Run was the sort of town where a day had a shape coffee at 6 school buses at 7, the whistle at the mill at noon, and porch lights softening on at dusk. Most mornings, I'd take the long way to work down Maple, where the oaks stooped toward the road past the baseball diamond where the chalk lines were never straight, and across the bridge that held the river like a ribbon somebody meant to tie. In summer, the heat came on steady by 10, the air thick enough that a man's shirt would stick between the shoulder blades. You knew the temperature without checking a number. If the cicadas were rattling by mid-afternoon, it was pushing 90. If the dogs were sleeping under trucks, it had crossed it. The hills around Cedar Run rolled up toward the Blue Ridge, and the lake out at Laurel Ridge sat in a bowl of trees 30-odd feet deep, where the old roadbed disappeared and shallow as a puddle near the picnic tables. I taught church kids to respect that lake water, what looks calm, can hide old stumps and drop-offs the color of tea. I knew the Hartleys the way you know good people in a small place, not because anything dramatic happened, but because nothing did. Tom would wave me down if he saw a belt squeal in my patrol car and tell me to bring it by the shop 2 bolts and a prayer. Mike, you'll be fine. Ruth worked mornings at the bookstore on Main, where the bell jingled twice by habit a second time as the door eased back. Their girl Megan came into the station once with her class for a civic tour. She stood out because she listened like a person taking notes in her head, deep-set eyes, white tank top under a denim jacket, camera peeking out of her bag like a puppy interested in the world. She asked me what kind of knot kept a strap from sliding off a shoulder. I pulled a scrap of cord from my desk and showed her the double back with a tug. She did it once, twice, then smiled when it held. Some people care about small solutions. That's how I remember her. Cedar Run wasn't a town of secrets so much as it was a town of boundaries everyone respected. You helped at the food pantry, you mowed around the old stones at Pine Grove Cemetery, and you kept an eye on teenagers at the lake without making a fuss. When Laurel Ridge's summer crowd from Asheville drifted in with kayaks strapped to Subarus, our folks nodded and stepped aside at the boat ramp. We all shared the water, and there was plenty of it. On Friday nights, the diner did a meatloaf special, and the old record player by the register hissed Patsy Cline through a speaker with a dent in the grill. I sat at the counter more than once with Sheriff Pierce when his wife worked the next town over, and he'd tell me the same thing every time a case knocked loud at midnight. We don't outrun trouble here, Mike. We meet it at the driveway and ask it what it thinks it's doing. In the summer of '98, the town ran on the bright energy of kids newly free from classes. You'd see them on bikes, hair stuck to their necks, a wad of cash for snacks clenched in a damp fist. College kids drifted home, flopped on couches, and took shifts at the diner, the gas station, the hardware store where the screen door always caught on its spring and bounced. Laura Bennett, tall and quick with a laugh she couldn't stifle, worked the late shift at Little Creek Diner, tapping orders into the new black and green screen like she was sending messages to space. Megan came by on Thursdays for pie when her mom could spare the car. They'd sit shoulder to shoulder in a booth under the AC vent forks, crossing like they were fencing eyes on some plan only 19-year-olds see clearly. If you stood at the boat launch at dusk, you'd hear the lake split by a paddle and the faint clink of someone tightening a tent pole against a breeze that comes off water and finds shoulders. Raccoons fussed along the tree line the way raccoons always do, and owls called from a stand of poplar like somebody ought to answer back. Summer storms slid over the ridge with a brave face, then broke themselves against the hills quick and loud, leaving the air clean and the gravel roads patterned with rivulets running toward the culverts. I knew the underground map as well as the roads, how rain moved under the county, like a second set of streets carved by limestone and old water, how a sinkhole could drink a whole season if you didn't respect it. I kept my home on the south end of town, white siding going gray until my brother shamed me into painting it a maple out front that clogged the gutters like it had a grudge. On work nights, Ruth would sometimes call the non-emergency line. She knew it wasn't trouble just to check when the lake gate closed or whether the sheriff planned another safety lecture at church. Folks are asking, she'd say, then laugh at herself for pretending it wasn't her. She was particular without being fussy the way mothers are when they've learned that attention keeps a household from drifting into chaos. Tom was the ballast, steady but not inflexible, a man who could fix a carburetor and a mood with equal patience. In a town where everyone knows whose pickup leaves at 5:40 a.m., routine becomes a kind of lullaby. I carried that rhythm with me without thinking, paper on the porch step by 6 dog fed by 6:05 cruiser, rolling by 6:20. I remember the feel of it in my bones, the way my hips adjusted to the seat, the hum where the dash light buzzed if you tapped it just wrong. Normal days stacked on normal days and made a platform you didn't realize you were standing on until it shifted. Megan reminded me of that platform, how light it felt when you're 19 and the whole thing seems built just for you. She loved the ridgeline behind town where the trail rolls up past the power cut and slips into shade. I ran into her and Laura up there one afternoon in late June, my boots heavier than theirs, their chatter lifting off like birds. They asked me if black bears were out this early in summer. I told them yes, but bears in our county were more interested in cool dirt and unguarded lunch meat than people. "Sing when you walk," I said, "and hang your food where a raccoon can't reach it." Laura told me she'd sing, but not in public. Megan laughed and said raccoons had standards. She was quick like that humor without bite ease, without showing off. I noticed little things that only matter later, the double-back knot on the shoulder strap of her green pack, the way she kept her trail map folded so the lake loop showed first, the disposable camera peeking in and out, because she liked catching the ordinary before it moved. She would nod to strangers just enough to be polite, and then go back to watching the water, looking at it like she could memorize the color. When she asked about the forecast, she listened to my answer like it belonged to her plan, mid-80s by afternoon. A chance of thunder rolling off the ridge tomorrow. Nothing you can't manage if you set your stakes and mind the sky. If there were cracks in that summer, they were hairlines you only feel when you run your palm over a finished board. The diner started keeping the back door propped open a little longer at night because the air wouldn't move, and the screen door hinge squeaked like a cricket with a grudge. The payphone outside the hardware store would ring sometimes, and no one would be there when you lifted it, just the open line breathing. The county patched the pothole near mile 4 for the 3rd time, and still the water found its way back in because water remembers where the ground gives. None of that sounded like trouble. It sounded like July. On the Friday, I'm thinking about, nothing stood up and called itself important. I signed for a shipment of first aid kits the church league had ordered and dropped them by the fellowship hall. I walked the river path at lunch to get my steps because my doctor had started using words like cholesterol when he looked at my file. I stopped at the bookstore to buy a used copy of Cold Mountain because Ruth had slipped it behind the counter and told me I'd like it if I gave it more than 30 pages. She and I talked quick about heat advisories, and the sale bin and the little bell over the door chimed twice when I left, as always. Evening drew out with that long Carolina light that makes everything look better than it is. Porch flags lifted once and fell. Air purred through window units across town like everyone exhaled together. At the lake, folks grilled hot dogs and a boy learned how to flip a canoe without crying about it. The sheriff signed off the radio to have supper with his sister on Cedar Lane, and I told the night dispatcher I'd put my phone on the charger because the battery had a mind of its own. The routine was so intact you could balance a dime on it. Tom washed his hands at the utility sink behind the shop, greasy water cutting thin rivulets down his forearms. He locked up the bay doors and turned the keys in the register, counted twice because that's what honest men do. Ruth left a note on their kitchen counter about a paperback she meant to bring to church Sunday for the donation table and drew a heart next to Megan's name like she did when her daughter was little. Across town, Laura finished the late shift at the diner apron, damp with iced tea. The soft thud of the cash drawer, a lullaby she'd heard all summer. As the sun laid down behind the ridge, the temperature eased just enough that the dog pried himself from under my porch and went snuffling after something that had no business under the azaleas. I carried the trash to the curb and listened to the river say what it always says. A low, even voice working on the same sentence it's been finishing for 1,000 years. Somewhere out at Laurel Ridge, someone tightened a tent line they thought didn't need it, and then tightened it again. I picture a paperback left open on a picnic table because bugs prefer the lamp. I picture a flip phone on a tabletop like a little square of future in a world not built for it yet, and a soda can collecting dew until it slides. The night fell in the ordinary way. Streetlights kicked on like a series of polite nods. Somebody dragged a hose across a yard and forgot to turn it off. At my house, I set the alarm clock, listened for the click that means it will do its job, and stood a second longer than usual by the kitchen window without knowing why. Out on Maple, a porch light stayed on a little past habit, and a second one joined it because that's what neighbors do in a town that thinks light can talk a night into behaving. I went to bed with the window raised enough to catch the faintest thread of air. The dog padded twice around, sighed like an old man, and dropped to the floor by the door. The red digits of the alarm clock rolled from 11:59 to 12:00. With a soft tick, I felt more than heard. Somewhere between those two numbers, the heat relented just a hair. The oak leaves ruffled like they were turning over to the cool side, and the phone on my nightstand lay quiet. It had no reason to ring. That's what I told myself as I let the dark finish its work. Just before sleep took me, a line of distant thunder folded itself into the hills, the kind that promises rain without hurrying it. Far off down toward Laurel Ridge, a single pair of headlights drifted along the county road and never turned into any driveway I knew. On Maple, 2 porch lights kept burning long after the bugs tired of them holding open a little circle of comfort that didn't seem to touch the street. My phone stayed still on the nightstand, black screen facing up as the house settled and the clock clicked over 1 more minute. No one noticed. It was the kind of morning that felt too still for July, the air heavy and unmoving like it was waiting for something to shift. I remember standing on my porch with a mug of coffee watching a thin line of clouds stretch over the ridge. By mid-afternoon, I'd be called to the lake. When the radio cracked to life, I didn't know it yet, but every quiet habit I'd described the night before the porch lights, the sound of the river, the phone that didn't ring would turn into markers on a map I'd carry with me for the rest of my life. The dispatcher's voice was calm in the way people get when they're reading from a card, possible missing camper. Laurel Ridge, parents en route. That was it. No panic yet, no rush of sirens. Just a sentence that didn't match the day. I drove out along the county road, the asphalt shimmering in the heat. When I reached the turnoff for the park gate, I saw Tom Hartley's truck already there, dust still settling behind it. He was standing by the hood, arms crossed tight like he was holding himself together. His face had the color drained out of it. "She didn't come home," he said, before I even asked. "Her phone, nothing since last night. Ruth's at home, calling everyone." He handed me a scrap of paper with the words "green tent" by the waterline scrawled across it. I'd seen Tom worried before, an engine misfiring, a kid sick, but never like this. There's a particular kind of quiet that comes over a father when fear starts to feel real. He doesn't talk loud, because he's still hoping volume can't make it true. We drove down the service road to the lake together. The afternoon light hit the water like hammered metal too bright to look at directly. I found her tent before I found my footing, small, green, neat as a diagram. The zipper was half open. Inside, a sleeping bag unrolled but untouched, a paperback lying face down mid-sentence. A half-used can of soup sat on the picnic table stove beside it, cool to the touch. There was no mess, no sign of struggle, no scuffle in the dirt. Just absence as deliberate as a footprint never made. I crouched, scanning the ground, tracing small impressions near the table. Maybe sneakers, maybe earlier in the day, but nothing clear enough to tell a story. The backpack was gone. So was the phone. Everything else was right where it should be, as if she'd stepped away for a moment and forgot to come back. I called it in. Within an hour, a cruiser from the sheriff's office rolled up, followed by the search and rescue truck and 2 volunteers from the fire department. Sheriff Pierce climbed out, last hat in his hand, eyes scanning the tree line like he could will her back. We divided the area into quadrants, sent dogs along the trail, and set up a perimeter by the water. The air smelled of pine and gasoline. A helicopter circled once blades, chopping the quiet into nervous fragments. I watched Tom pace the shoreline, calling her name, voice catching on the syllables. When night started pressing down, we lit the first set of flood lamps and ran the generators till the fuel ran low. Every beam of light just made more shadows. By morning, the search grew. Rangers, volunteers, and neighbors showed up with thermoses and work gloves. They brought boats ropes and flashlights. It's strange how quickly a community organizes around fear. You can almost measure love by how many people show up at dawn with no one telling them to. I took the west trail where the path narrows between poplars and climbs toward the ridge. The ground there was soft from rain 2 nights earlier, but nothing showed. No shoe prints, no drag marks, no broken branches. The dogs picked up scent near the campsite and lost it 10 yards in, like the trail itself had stopped breathing. When Ruth arrived that afternoon, I met her by the ranger's truck. She had a folded flyer in her hand. Megan's photo, the one from her college ID, smiling sunlight in her hair. She texted her friend last night. Ruth said, her voice breaking only on the last word, said she heard something outside her tent. I asked who she'd sent it to. Laura, she said. Around midnight. That detail hit like a stone dropped in still water, small at first, then spreading wide. I had Laura brought in from town, still in her diner uniform, apron strings loose at her waist. She kept apologizing before she even told me what she'd seen. I thought it was raccoons, she whispered. I told her not to worry. Then my message wouldn't send. I went to bed. I told her she did nothing wrong, but she didn't believe me. People rarely do when guilt finds a place to sit. By the second night, the search had turned into something else. The organized hope of the first day hardened into routine maps spread across hoods, red lines, drawn radios, crackling boots damp with dew. The water team dragged the shallow edge of the lake, pulling up nothing but branches and silt. The woods were too quiet even for that time of year. No frogs, no nightbirds. Just the sound of engines cooling and men coughing into their sleeves. I kept walking the same circle around that tent, unwilling to step too close, but unable to leave it. A paperback, a spoon, a soda can, all reminders of how normal it must have felt to her just hours before. By Sunday, local reporters had caught wind of it. They showed up with cameras' lenses, catching the yellow tape like trophies. One of them asked me if it looked like foul play. I told him it looked like a 19-year-old girl was missing. That was all I could say. But even then, deep down, I knew something didn't add up. A person doesn't vanish without a trace, not in daylight, not on familiar ground. And yet, here we were staring at a campsite as tidy as a photograph, and a trail that ended before it began. That night, the sheriff called a meeting in the ranger cabin. We'd been awake nearly 40 hours. Maps, flashlights, and damp coffee cups covered every surface. Pierce rubbed his eyes and said what none of us wanted to hear. We're out of leads. He wasn't giving up, just facing what was in front of him. I suggested widening the search past the ridge toward the sinkhole area where rainwater carved channels underground. She knew those woods, I said. If she got spooked, she might have tried to find the road and gone off trail. Pierce nodded, but his eyes didn't hold much belief. We'll check it at first light, he said. Then we'll reassess. When I drove home that night, my clothes smelled like smoke and damp earth. The porch lights on Maple Street were still burning, same as before, but they looked different now, less like comfort, more like sentinels waiting for news. I showered, tried to sleep, failed. Around 2, thunder rolled over the ridge and the rain came down hard, drumming against the roof in steady sheets. I lay there thinking of that tent, the zipper half open, the nylon sagging under water weight. Somewhere in that downpour, any trace we might have found washed away. By the next morning, the county line was flooded. The trails were mud slicks and the creek had swallowed its banks. We pushed through it anyway, boots sinking, radio static cutting through the rain. I stopped at the old drainage culvert near the logging road, a rusted pipe barely wide enough for a grown man to crawl through. The current hissed through it like a snake. I knelt and ran my light along the edge. Nothing but debris sticks, leaves one glove that might have been from a hunter. I told myself I'd remember it anyway. Sometimes a hunch is all you can hold on to. Days turned into weeks. The flyers multiplied on telephone poles curling at the corners under the heat. People still came by the sheriff's office to drop off tips. Saw a girl hitchhiking, heard something near the quarry. My cousin swears she saw her in Knoxville. We chased everyone, and everyone ended the same way. Nothing. I watched Ruth shrink in those weeks, her voice getting smaller each time I called with no news. Tom stopped talking altogether except to ask if we'd checked the ridge again. Even Laura, the friend, came by less, said she couldn't stand the smell of pine anymore. Guilt does strange math. It counts in seconds, not years. Summer slipped into fall. The tourists went home and the lake turned cold. The tent, the stove, the paperback, they'd all been boxed and tagged as evidence. But I kept the knot she'd tied in that pack strap in my desk drawer. I didn't know why. Maybe it made me feel like something in this story was still connected to a person, and not just a case file. Sheriff Pierce filed his final report in November. Suspicious disappearance. No body recovered. I signed it as witness. Then the folder went to the back shelf behind other names that never came home. But I couldn't let it go. I'd drive out to Laurel Ridge once a month, even after I retired, just to stand where the tent had been. The grass grew back, erasing the circle of dirt where the stakes had bitten in. When wind moved across the water, it sounded like whispering under breath, too soft to catch. Sometimes I'd find things, an old soda tab, a fishing lure, a scrap of tarp, and each time my pulse jumped before my brain reminded me it wasn't her. You'd think after so many years in this line of work, you'd get used to the not knowing. You don't. It just becomes a room you learn how to sit in. 10 years passed before anything changed. 10 years of porch lights still left on birthdays without candles, and a mother who stopped wearing perfume because her daughter used to say she could smell it halfway down the hall. It was July again, hot and heavy, when the call came through. 2 kayakers exploring the river downstream had found a pack lodged in a limestone cave. Green nylon, waterlogged. Straps knotted twice on the shoulder. My first thought wasn't relief. It was dread. Because I knew what that meant. Something the earth had held on to was finally letting go. When I arrived at the river mouth that evening, the air was thick with the smell of wet stone and algae. The kayakers stood by their boats, faces pale, still trying to process what they'd pulled from the dark. The pack sat on a rock ledge like it had been placed there, mud seeping from the seams, a decade of silence folded inside. I crouched, reached out, and laid a hand on the fabric. It was smaller now, the way time shrinks things, and in that quiet cave the sound of dripping water echoed like a heartbeat. slow, patient, reminding us all that some answers don't come when you're ready. I didn't open it then. Not yet. You learn after years on this side of loss that the moment before truth is its own kind of mercy. I let the sound of the river fill the silence, watched the flashlight beams dance along the cave wall, and thought about a 19-year-old girl who once tied her strap just so, believing it would hold. Outside, thunder mumbled over the ridge again, the same sound as the night she disappeared, and the rain began to fall. I knew, even before the first drop hit the water, that whatever we found in that backpack would not bring her home, but it would speak, and after 10 years of quiet, that was something worth listening to. The morning after the backpack came out of that cave, the world seemed to move slower, like even the air had learned to hold its breath. Word spread fast, too fast for a small town that still remembered the day her flyers went up. I walked into the sheriff's office just after sunrise, the floorboards creaking under my boots, and found Pierce at his desk with a mug that had gone cold. The pack sat on a towel beside him, still damp, the color muted to a shade between moss and smoke. 10 years of water and limestone had thinned the fabric, but the knot on the shoulder strap, the one I'd shown her that day in my office, was still there. I stood a long time before I spoke. "That's hers," I said, though everyone in the room already knew. We didn't open it right away. Some evidence demands silence before it speaks. When the technicians arrived, we all crowded into the small conference room. The air smelled of wet nylon and mildew. They laid each item out carefully, a flashlight corroded to gray, a paperback swollen thick as a sponge, a tin whistle. I remembered her buying at the general store for a music elective, and finally a disposable camera sealed in a cloudy plastic shell. There was a trail map, too, folded along the lake loop, and a gas station receipt from the day she left home. Time had turned everything fragile, edges soft ink fading, but the handwriting on that map, her small, neat print, was still legible. I traced one line with my thumb, following her penciled notes until it ended at the water's edge. I wondered if that was where she first felt afraid. The photos took weeks. A lab 3 states away had the chemicals and patience to pull images from a roll that old. While we waited, the sheriff reopened the file. We dragged old reports out of storage boxes that smelled of dust and regret. 10 years hadn't changed much, except the color of the folders. The case still began and ended at the same campsite, the same empty tent. The only new thing now was that backpack and whatever stories its contents might still hold. Ruth and Tom came by every few days, mostly to sit. Ruth brought coffee she never drank. Tom stood by the window with his arms folded, watching the parking lot like something might appear there. Hope makes people do strange arithmetic. It counts what's missing and calls it proof. When the envelope from the lab finally came, Pierce opened it with hands that didn't quite trust themselves. The photographs were printed small, the kind you'd tuck into a wallet. Most were harmless. The lake at sunset, the tent half-built a soda can beside a paperback. All of it looked like a weekend gone right. Then came one frame that changed the air in the room. The flash had gone off in the dark, lighting the inside of the tent. The nylon glowed pale, but there was a shadow pressed against it, a bulge 5 uneven shapes spread like a hand. The photo was grainy, blurred at the edges, but there was no mistaking it. Someone or something had been right outside. The final frame was worse in a quieter way. It caught a patch of ground, a line of pine needles, and 2 oval marks close together as if feet had been planted just beyond the zipper. Between them, the faint glint of metal, a tent tooth catching the light, twisted as though the door had been tugged. No faces, no movement, just enough to know she wasn't alone. Pierce set the pictures down and leaned back in his chair. The room was silent except for the slow buzz of the fluorescent light. "She took these after that text," I said. It wasn't a question. We sent the negatives back for digital analysis, hoping for more clarity, but some truths resist sharpening. Still, it was enough to breathe life into a dead file. The sheriff's office called a press briefing. cautious but hopeful. New evidence recovered in the disappearance of Megan Hartley. The statement read, "No promises, just those words." Reporters returned old and new, filling the parking lot with cameras and cables. For a few days, the case was everywhere again, radio, television, papers that hadn't printed her name in years. Folks who'd moved away called home to ask if we'd found her. We hadn't. We'd just found a fragment of the question. Within a week, 2 cavers from the university came by to map the area beneath the ridge. They spread their charts across my old desk, tracing lines where the water tunneled under the hills. They explained how the limestone acted like a sponge, swallowing streams and spitting them out miles away. One of them pointed to a depression on the map. "There's a sinkhole about a mile from her campsite," he said. "If she or her gear ended up near that drainage, it could have washed into the same system as the cave." I asked if a person could fit through. He hesitated. "Maybe at the mouth," he said. "Not once it narrows." That left us with a new question: if she couldn't go through, who or what carried her pack there before the floods? A thunderstorm rolled through that afternoon, sudden and heavy, the kind that leaves the world steaming afterward. I drove out to the sinkhole with a small team once the rain stopped. The air smelled of metal and mud. The hole itself was half choked with roots and leaves, the edges slick. We rigged ropes and went down as far as it allowed. The mud was soft, almost oily, the sound of dripping constant. Near the lip where the passage tightened, one of the deputies brushed aside a mat of debris and found a shred of faded green fabric snagged on rock. It was too small to test, but we knew that color. It matched the pack. Above us, the clouds were moving fast again, low and restless. We climbed out just as the first drops hit, and by the time we reached the trucks, the sky opened up. Rain poured through that sinkhole like a drain, swallowing years of silence. Back at the office, I couldn't shake the image of that water carrying her belongings through the dark miles of unseen tunnels connecting the lake, the sinkhole, and the cave where the kayakers had found the pack. Nature had built a labyrinth, and we were 10 years too late to follow it. Still, we kept trying. The next week, one of the deputies clearing brush near an old service road found something half buried in the mud, a small black rectangle, edges rusted, barely recognizable. When he cleaned it off, the lettering came through a phone battery from the late 90s, the kind used in flip phones. It was lodged near the drainage pipe that fed the same underground flow. We all stood there a moment, no one talking, just listening to the water trickle beneath us. I turned the battery over in my hand. The mud clung to my skin. It was a tiny thing smaller than a matchbook, but I couldn't stop thinking about how that phone had lit her face when she sent the last message. How that small glow might have been the only light left before the dark closed in. For a few weeks, the discovery stirred up the same cycle of attention we'd been through before: renewed searches, interviews, theories. Most were noise. Some bordered on cruelty. People speculated about strangers, lovers, hitchhikers, everything but the simple truth we didn't know. The only consistent fact was that her phone and pack had followed the same underground road carried by stormwater through rock and time until the earth decided to give them back. What it hadn't returned was the girl herself. We re-examined the photographs under new equipment, the digital kind that could pull shape out of shadow. On the tent image just near the edge of that handprint, the software caught a faint curve, a reflection, maybe a small arc that could have been metal. The lab's report was cautious, possibly a watch crown, possibly a ring. It didn't matter which. Both meant someone had been there. I thought about that storm the night she vanished, the way rain can make a man believe he's alone even when he isn't. Maybe whoever was out there had watched the light of her phone fade through the nylon, had seen her hesitate before unzipping the door. Maybe that's when the world split in two, before and after, and everything she carried started moving toward the places we'd find them years later. The sheriff ordered one more ground search along the service road where the battery had surfaced. We cleared brush that hadn't been touched in years, the air thick with the smell of cut vines and gasoline. A few hundred yards uphill, we came across the remains of an old culvert, half-collapsed water trickling through rust. Inside, we found scratches, parallel grooves etched into the metal too, even to be natural. They ran about the width of a phone battery, spaced close together like something metal had been forced through by flood. I took a picture, knowing it wouldn't prove much, but wanting the record anyway. Sometimes the small, useless things feel like the only thread you have left to hold. When the day ended, I drove the long way home past the diner where Laura used to work. The lights were on the sign flickering, but the counter was mostly empty. I thought about how she'd carried that guilt all these years. The message. She didn't answer soon enough. The voice she never heard again. She'd moved away for a time, I'd heard, but the anniversary always brought her back. Some part of her, like all of us, still listened for that phone to buzz for one last text that might make sense of everything that followed. But phones don't ring after 10 years, and rivers don't give back what they don't want to. That night after the house settled and the clock on the dresser ticked through another sleepless hour, I went out to the porch. The sky was clear stars, sharp as glass. From that distance, the ridge looked peaceful, just another dark line against the horizon. But I knew better. Underneath those hills ran a second-world tunnels, caves, silent corridors carved by water and time. Somewhere in that world, pieces of her still-lingered fabric caught on stone, a shoe, maybe bone turned pale as the rock around it. The thought wasn't morbid. It was just the shape truth sometimes takes when you run out of hope. Before I went back inside, I looked at the horizon one more time. Lightning flickered beyond the mountains far enough away that I couldn't hear the thunder yet. Another storm was coming, same as that night years ago. And I knew deep down that when it passed, the earth might shift again, might loosen something we hadn't found or bury it deeper. Either way, the story wasn't finished. Some part of it was still moving underground, waiting for the next flood to speak. When that storm finally broke over the ridge, it came with the kind of thunder that makes your windows hum. I remember standing at the sink watching the rain lash the streetlights and thinking how much the night sounded like the one she disappeared in. By morning, the rivers had swollen again, brown and fast, carving out pieces of earth that hadn't moved in years. And like clockwork, when water tears at the land, it starts spitting out what it's been keeping. The first call came from a fisherman who worked the low stretch of river east of town. He said his line had caught on something heavy, and when he pulled it in, it wasn't a branch or an old tire. It was a shoe. A small white sneaker, cracked, waterlogged, and caked in silt. I drove out there myself. It lay in the grass like something half-remembered, the laces still tied, the tread barely visible. Tom and Ruth came later that afternoon. She didn't need to touch it. She just looked, and the sound she made wasn't a cry. Not really, it was smaller than that. She had a pair just like those, Ruth said quietly. We bought them for the trip. She said they felt too stiff, but she'd break them in. That was all she said. Tom just kept his hand on her shoulder until she stopped shaking. We sent the shoe to the lab, though everyone already knew what the answer would be, too long submerged, no viable trace left. The fibers had taken on the smell of the river, that cold mineral scent that never washes out. Still, I stayed there by the bank longer than I meant to, watching the current fold over itself. You tell yourself the water's just doing what it's always done, carrying things from one place to another, but when you've spent half your life chasing missing people, you start to think it knows more than it lets on. A few weeks later, the lab finished enhancing the last few photographs from her camera. Technology had come a long way in 10 years, and what they showed us wasn't clearer exactly, it was just more undeniable. The handprint on the tent wall, the faint shape of a wrist, the shine that had once been dismissed as a smudge now had definition. You could see the metal of a wristwatch catching the flash. Not hers. She never wore one, her mother confirmed that. And in the corner of that final ground, shot something new appeared under the digital filters. a partial boot print blurred in motion larger than her own. We gathered in the same conference room as before, the air heavy with that same smell of damp paper and coffee gone cold. Pierce studied the photo like it was breathing. "That's not storm damage," he muttered. "That's a man standing too close." He was right, and suddenly all the years of telling ourselves maybe she'd gotten lost, maybe the flood had taken her, it all felt like wishful thinking. She hadn't been alone that night. She'd seen someone, or someone had seen her. The story caught fire again once the news picked it up. Local stations ran side-by-sides of the photo and the old flyers, and you could feel the tension ripple through town like static. People remembered rumors from years ago, a stranger at the gas station, a drifter who'd camped near the trailhead, an older student who used to hike that same loop. Everyone wanted to fill the silence with something. I knew better than to trust the noise, but I also knew this evidence. This direct, even grainy, doesn't lie. It only waits to be understood. The sheriff approved another ground sweep, this time focused on the ridge above the drainage pipe where we'd found the phone battery. The forest had reclaimed most of its roots thick enough to trip on saplings growing right through old tire tracks. We brought in ground-penetrating radar, hoping for anomalies, air pockets, disturbed soil, anything unnatural. Hours went by with nothing but static on the monitor until one of the techs slowed the feed and pointed at the screen. There, beneath about 4 feet of earth, was a void, not large, but deliberate. We started digging by hand. The first thing we uncovered was debris bottle glass, a rusted soda can, the broken buckle from a belt. Then came the dogs. They moved in tight circles, whining, pawing at the ground where the radar had shown the pocket. Their handlers exchanged glances. You get a sense, after enough years, of when a dog's reacting to something that isn't just earth. But what we found wasn't human. Animal bones scattered and weathered. Deer, most likely. Still, the reaction left all of us uneasy. The soil held a scent we couldn't identify, faint but wrong. That night, as we packed up, Pierce said what everyone was thinking. "If she's out here," he murmured, "she's not above ground." He wasn't trying to be cruel, he was just tired of pretending the woods were only keeping secrets. I looked out across the ridge where the trees leaned like old men in the wind, and I felt the same quiet certainty. These hills were keeping something they didn't plan to return easily. For a while I thought that was where the story would stop again, another search ending in questions. But then a small detail from the earlier photos started nagging at me. On the very edge of the frame, barely visible, was a number painted on bark. 27. I remembered an old service road marker with that number used back when the logging company ran equipment through the valley. The road itself had washed out years before, but I drove up there anyway. The woods were thick sun breaking through in narrow stripes. I found the remains of the sign, just a corner of metal nailed to a tree. The paint faded, but still legible. 27. Nearby, half buried under moss, was the mouth of another culvert, smaller than the one by the drainage. It had been dry for years, but you could see how water had once rushed through it, carving grooves into the rusted pipe. I knelt beside it, brushing away leaves, and caught sight of something dark lodged just inside. I reached in slow, expecting another stick or stone. What I pulled out was rectangular and slick with mud, a piece of plastic heavier than it looked. I wiped it on my sleeve, and there it was, a corroded battery label, same model as the one we'd found before. My stomach turned over. The creek had carved a loop between the two sites. It wasn't chance. Whatever happened to her, it all began along this forgotten stretch of road. When I brought it back to the office, Pierce turned it over in his palm, the way you might hold a small bird. "She was here," he said quietly. "Maybe running, maybe led." He looked at me, then the kind of look that asks if you want to keep digging into something that might undo you. I nodded. Some cases aren't choices anymore. The next few weeks blurred into interviews and dead ends. We brought in every name ever mentioned back in '98. One man, a seasonal worker who'd camped nearby, had long since moved out west. Another had died years earlier. None of it stuck. The river, the storms, and time had done their work, erasing tracks, blurring everything except the ache left behind. Ruth stopped coming to the office. She told Pierce she'd rather remember her daughter before the woods took her. I couldn't blame her. Every new discovery felt less like a lead and more like the earth teasing us with what we couldn't have back. Then autumn came. The air cooled, the leaves dropped, and the ground turned hard again. I thought maybe that was the end of it, the file ready to settle back into the drawer. But life has a way of waiting for you to look away before it moves again. A month after the second battery was logged, a fisherman downriver called in something caught on his line. The details sounded familiar enough that I drove out myself. The banks were lined with frost that morning, thin enough to crack underfoot. The man stood knee-deep in the current, holding his rod like he didn't want to move. When he lifted the line, I saw what hung from it. Cloth green, once, now gray and heavy with mud. A scrap no larger than a hand torn from a larger piece long ago. It matched the same weave as the backpack. He watched me pull it free and said almost to himself, "Feels like the river's still trying to talk." I nodded because I knew exactly what he meant. Every storm seemed to loosen another word of a story too old to hear in full. I sealed the fabric in a bag, wrote the date on the label, and stared at it a long time before I left. That night back home, I sat on the porch as the wind came up again, smelling of rain and cold stone. I thought about her last message, about that faint glow of a phone in a dark tent, and the courage it must have taken to type those words. I keep hearing noises outside my tent. It wasn't panic, it was observation. She'd heard something she couldn't explain and reached for the only thing she could control. 10 years later, I was still listening for what she might have heard. Somewhere beneath those hills, there's a road. The water follows a tunnel between past and present. It's carried her belongings one by one, like the land itself is trying to remind us she was real. I used to think it would end with one final discovery, something clear, something that would let her parents finally sleep. But the truth moves slower than we do. It comes up in fragments, cloth metal, a flash of light on film, and then disappears again. When I turned in that last evidence report, Pierce asked me if I thought we'd ever find her. I told him honestly, if she's still out there, she's waiting on the water to tell us how. He nodded once, quiet, and went back to his desk. Outside, the rain started again, soft at first, then harder, the same rhythm it had all those years ago. And I knew, as sure as I knew my own name, that somewhere along that ridge, something else would surface one day. Maybe not a body, maybe not an answer, but something that belonged to her, carried through the dark, all this time still looking for light. The rain that night didn't sound like weather anymore. It sounded like something breathing, steady, slow, almost gentle against the roof. I sat at my kitchen table, the file open beside a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. Across the street, someone's porch light flickered against the storm, the same pale color as the ones that had burned all those years while she was missing. It's strange the way certain sounds or sights pull you backward. For me, every rainfall since that summer has carried the same rhythm, like the land reminding me it's still keeping watch. After we found that last scrap of her backpack, the case shifted from noise to quiet. The papers, the interviews, the maps, they stopped meaning much. The water had given back everything it wanted to, and no amount of digging could make it speak again. The sheriff's office never issued a new statement. There was nothing to announce, just more fragments, a fabric sample, a half-buried battery, and a shoe that had already told us what we didn't want to hear. You can close a file, but that doesn't mean the story ends. It just changes hands. Ruth and Tom came by once more that fall. They didn't ask for updates. They just wanted to see the ridge before winter closed it off. I went with them walking the same trail that used to be a service road. The air was thin and cold enough to sting your throat. Ruth carried a small bunch of daisies, their stems wrapped in twine. When we reached the spot where the sinkhole started, she placed them in the hollow between two roots and whispered something I couldn't catch. Tom stood behind her, his hands in his coat pockets, eyes fixed on the horizon. We didn't talk about evidence or storms or theories. There was nothing left to explain. After a while, they thanked me softly the way people do when words have to stand in for something bigger, and drove home together in silence. A year later, I attended a memorial service by the lake. It wasn't official, just family, a few neighbors, and the search volunteers who'd never stopped coming back. Someone had built a small wooden bench facing the water. Her name was carved into it along with the words, "Forever Exploring." It was simple, but it felt right. The wind that afternoon carried a chill off the water, but the sun cut through the clouds just long enough to make the ripples shine. People shared short stories, the way she laughed the time she brought cookies to a cleanup drive, how she'd hum when she didn't realize anyone was listening. They weren't grand memories, just the kind that live in the corners of a day. I remember thinking that maybe that's what survival looks like for the living, learning to keep small things alive when the big ones are gone. After I retired, I boxed up most of my old case files, but not hers. Hers stayed in the top drawer of my desk where I could reach it without thinking. Every once in a while, I'd open it and unfold the map. She drew the pencil lines still faintly visible, the edges worn soft. I'd trace her route with my finger the same way I used to when we first searched for her, and I'd stop where the line met the lake. There's a comfort in repetition, even when it hurts. It's the only way I know to keep her real. People still ask me what I think happened. Some are curious, others just want a story with a clean ending. I don't blame them. We all like the idea that the truth can be found if you look hard enough. But I've come to believe there are two kinds of truth. There's the kind you can write down in a report, dates, evidence, coordinates, and then there's the kind that only exists in the spaces between. The second one isn't made of facts. It's made of what we feel when the facts stop talking. I think she was frightened that night, but not reckless. I think she heard something or someone and tried to leave before the storm hit. And I think whoever stood outside her tent followed her into the dark. Beyond that, I don't know, and maybe I never will. I still walk those trails sometimes. The trees have grown thicker, the path narrower, but the place hasn't lost its stillness. Every fall, the leaves turn that same deep rust color that looks almost like dried blood when the sun hits it just right. I stop at the lake and sit on the bench they built. If you listen long enough, the sounds blend together, the lapping water, the wind through the reeds, the quiet creak of wood under your hand. It feels less like a crime scene now, and more like a grave that never got a stone. And maybe that's what she deserves. Not a headline, not an answer shouted into the void. Just a place where the people who loved her can come and sit and let the silence speak for itself. As the years have gone by, that silence has become the part of the job I carry the most. You think the hardest moments are the discoveries, the bones, the photos, the nights you tell a family, there's no news. But it isn't. It's the moments afterward, when the world moves on, and the family doesn't. When a porch light still burns years later because turning it off feels like giving up. When a mother still sets an extra place at the table during holidays, just in case. Those are the details that never leave you. A few winters ago, I ran into Laura Bennett, the friend who got that last message. She's in her 30s now, married, kids of her own. She told me she still has the old flip phone in a drawer, dead battery and all. "I can't bring myself to throw it away," she said. "Feels like if I do, I'll miss her if she ever calls." I told her I understood. And I do. Because memory isn't just what we keep, it's what we refuse to let go of, even when logic tells us it's time. Sometimes late at night, I think about all the evidence we gathered, the handprint on the tent, the torn nylon, the watch, glint the fragments of green cloth. Each piece on its own was small, almost meaningless. But together, they form a kind of outline, an unfinished shape of a girl, frozen in the last few minutes of her life. It's a portrait drawn by absence, by what the world forgot to return. And yet it's enough to remind us she was here. She mattered. Last spring, the county installed new safety signs along the trail, warnings about camping alone, flash flood advisories, a number to call for emergencies. Most folks walk past them without a second glance. But I stood there for a long time watching the ink dry on the post. Progress is a quiet thing. It doesn't fix what happened, but it makes sure the next name doesn't join hers. And maybe that's the closest we get to justice in cases like this, small changes that keep someone else from being lost to the same silence. I don't visit the Hartleys much anymore. Time has softened the edges of their grief, but not erased it. They moved to a smaller house outside town, closer to Ruth's sister. Every year on the anniversary, they mail a small donation to a local search and rescue group under her name. No message, just a check folded into a plain envelope. I think it's their way of keeping her part of something still moving. They've learned to live inside their loss without letting it consume them. That's not peace exactly, but it's something close. As for me, I've stopped looking for closure. The word feels too neat for a story that never really ends. What I've found instead is a kind of understanding. The earth holds its own timeline. It doesn't rush to reveal or forgive. It gives back what it wants when it's ready. 10 years, 20, it doesn't matter. When I hear the rain, I still imagine those tunnels beneath the ridge carrying bits of her story through stone and shadow, always moving, never still. Somewhere down there the water keeps telling it in its own way. Before I end this, I'll tell you one last thing. Last summer, on a morning clear as glass, a new hiker came across the bench by the lake and sent the sheriff's office a picture. The daisies Ruth left years ago had taken root beside it. Wild now, but blooming. Nobody planted them again, they just came back on their own. I like to think that means something. Maybe not everything needs to be solved for it to be remembered. Maybe some stories just need to be carried forward the way the river carries light after the rain. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views or numbers, but so her name doesn't fade. Because every time someone remembers, the dark loses a little more of its power. And somewhere out there, I believe the earth listens.